I didn't realize the moment my children stopped needing me. If you had asked me a year earlier, I would have said the same thing most parents say, that children grow up, they become independent, and that's exactly what we hope for. We raise them so they can stand on their own. We teach them to make their own decisions, solve their own problems, and eventually build lives that don't depend on us. That's the goal. At least that's what I always believed. But there's a quiet difference between knowing your children are independent and suddenly realizing they no longer come to you at all. The moment I understood that difference didn't come with a dramatic argument or some painful event. It arrived quietly one afternoon while I was standing in my kitchen, holding a coffee mug and staring at a phone that hadn't rung in days. Not because anything was wrong. Just because no one needed anything anymore. When my children were small, the house was never quiet. My son Michael was the oldest. He had been born during a thunderstorm in late summer, and my wife used to joke that the energy in that storm somehow followed him into the world. From the moment he could walk, he moved through the house like a small whirlwind. My daughter Emily came 3 years later. Where Michael was loud and curious, Emily was quieter but observant. She noticed things most people missed. When she was 4 years old, she once pointed at a tiny crack in the kitchen ceiling that neither my wife nor I had ever noticed before. "Is the house breaking?" she asked with serious concern. I remember kneeling beside her and explaining that houses settle sometimes, the same way people do. She seemed satisfied with that answer. Those early years blur together now in my memory, but certain moments remain clear in a way that surprises me. Saturday mornings were always loud. Cartoons on the television. The smell of pancakes drifting through the kitchen. Michael arguing about which syrup tasted better while Emily carefully arranged her pancakes into little stacks. There was always noise. Questions. Requests. "Dad, can you help me with this? Dad, can you fix this? Dad, look at what I made." I never thought much about how often I heard my name back then. It was simply part of life. Being a parent means constantly being called. And somehow, even when it was exhausting, it also felt like proof that you were needed. When Michael was 8 years old, he asked me to help him build a birdhouse for a school project. We spent 2 afternoons in the garage measuring wood, hammering nails, and arguing about whether the roof should be flat or slanted. Emily sat nearby with a coloring book, occasionally looking up to give opinions that neither of us had asked for. "That roof will leak," she said at one point. "It will not," Michael replied immediately. 2 weeks later, the first rainstorm proved Emily correct. Water pooled inside the birdhouse. Michael was devastated. But instead of throwing it away, we rebuilt the roof together. That's something I always loved about those years. Problems weren't endings. They were just reasons to spend more time together. As the kids grew older, our routines changed, but the feeling remained the same. Every evening around 6 o'clock we sat down for dinner. No phones. No television. Just the 4 of us around the table. Michael usually talked about school first. He had a way of telling stories about his teachers that made even the dullest days sound like an adventure. Emily listened quietly at first, then eventually added her own observations. My wife and I mostly watched and listened. Looking back now, I realize those dinners were probably the most peaceful moments of my life. At the time they felt ordinary. Now they feel priceless. Teenage years change things the way they always do. Michael discovered sports. Emily discovered books and music. The house was still full, but the children who once followed me everywhere now had their own lives forming around them. Still, they needed things. Advice. Help with homework. A ride somewhere. Money for school trips. The requests never really stopped. And strangely, I never minded them. Every time one of them asked for help, it reminded me that I still had a place in their world. Michael left for college first. I remember the day we packed his car. Boxes stacked in the back seat. A small refrigerator wedged into the trunk. Emily stood in the driveway pretending she wasn't emotional about her brother leaving. My wife cried quietly in the kitchen afterward. The house felt different that evening. Not empty. Just quieter. Emily left 2 years later. Her car was smaller, but somehow the driveway looked even emptier when she pulled away. My wife and I adjusted the way most parents do. We found new routines. New quiet. Phone calls replaced the constant presence we had grown used to. Michael called about his classes. Emily called to talk about books she was reading. Sometimes they asked for advice. Sometimes they simply wanted to talk. Those calls meant everything. Because even though the house was quieter, the connection remained. Or at least that's what I believed. Years passed quickly after that. Michael found a job in another state. Emily moved to a city even farther away. Visits became less frequent, but life was still busy enough that I didn't think much about it. Children grow up. They build their own lives. That's how it's supposed to work. Then my wife passed away. It happened faster than any of us expected. One moment we were planning a weekend trip. The next moment the house felt larger than it had ever been. The silence changed after that. Before, it had been peaceful. Now it felt heavier. Michael and Emily both came home for the funeral. We spent several days together sorting through old photographs, paperwork, and memories. At one point, Emily found a picture of the four of us standing beside the old birdhouse Michael and I had built years earlier. "The roof looks crooked," she said. Michael laughed. It leaked. For a moment we all laughed together. But eventually they returned to their lives. Their jobs. Their routines. And I returned to mine. At first, they called often. Checking in. Asking how I was doing. Making sure I wasn't alone too much. I appreciated those calls more than I could ever explain. But gradually, the frequency began to change. Not suddenly. Just slowly. A week between calls. Then 2. Then sometimes longer. When they did call, the conversations were shorter. They were busy. Work responsibilities. Travel. Friends. All the things that fill the lives of people still building their futures. I understood. At least I told myself I did. Still, one afternoon something happened that made me pause. I had just finished mowing the lawn and was standing in the kitchen pouring a glass of water when I realized something. For the first time in nearly 40 years. No one had asked me for help with anything in weeks. No school projects. No repairs. No advice. No questions. The house was quiet. The phone was silent. And suddenly a small, uncomfortable thought appeared in my mind. Maybe this was what life looked like when your children finally didn't need you anymore. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone on the counter. Not because I expected it to ring, but because I was trying to understand a feeling I had never experienced before. For most of my life, being a father meant being needed. Now I wasn't so sure what it meant anymore. For the next few weeks, I tried not to think too much about that moment in the kitchen. It felt like the kind of thought you shouldn't hold on to too tightly. The kind that can quietly grow into something larger if you let it. So I told myself what most parents tell themselves when their children become adults. They're busy. They have their own lives now. That's exactly what we spent years preparing them for. Still, certain habits are hard to break. Every morning I woke up around the same time I had for most of my working life. Even though I had retired 3 years earlier, my body never adjusted to sleeping in. By 7 o'clock I was usually sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window at the small maple tree in the yard. That tree had been planted the year Emily was born. Back then it barely reached my waist. Now its branches stretched high enough to brush the roof when the wind was strong. I often found myself watching the way sunlight moved through its leaves in the morning. It reminded me how slowly things change when you see them every day. Children are the same way. You don't notice how much they've grown until one day you look at them and realize the person standing in front of you is no longer the child you remember. One Tuesday morning, while I was sitting at the kitchen table, the phone rang. The sound startled me more than I expected. For a brief second I felt the same familiar anticipation I used to feel years ago when the kids were younger. I picked it up quickly. Hello? Hey, Dad. It was Michael. Just hearing his voice brought a small sense of relief I hadn't realized I was waiting for. Hi, Michael. How are you? I'm good, he said. Just busy with work. There was a short pause. Then he asked something simple. Did you ever figure out how to fix that leak in the garage roof? I smiled slightly. Yes, I replaced the shingles last month. Good. I was thinking about doing something similar on my place. We talked about roofing materials for a few minutes. Then the conversation drifted into other things: his job, a new project he had been working on, a coworker who had recently moved from another state. It wasn't a long conversation. Maybe 10 minutes. But when we hung up, the house didn't feel quite as quiet. Later that afternoon, I walked out to the garage. The smell of old wood and motor oil still lingered there the same way it had when the kids were small. A few shelves held tools that hadn't been used in a while. The red-handled hammer Michael had picked out from the hardware store years ago was still sitting in the same drawer. I picked it up for a moment. The paint on the handle had chipped over the years. But it was still solid. Holding it in my hand brought back a memory so clear I could almost hear it happening again. Michael standing beside me in the garage. Emily sitting nearby coloring. The sound of a nail being hammered slightly crooked into a wooden board. Back then the garage had been full of questions. Dad, how do you know where to put the nail? Dad, why do we measure twice? Dad, what happens if we mess it up? I had always answered those questions the best I could. But looking around the quiet garage now, I realized something. At some point, children stop asking those questions. Not because they stop caring, but because they eventually learn the answers themselves. That realization stayed with me during the following days. I started noticing small details I had overlooked before. The way the house stayed clean longer now that no one else lived there. The way the refrigerator seemed emptier even when it was full. The way the evenings stretched out quietly after dinner. One evening I sat down in the living room with an old photo album my wife had kept for years. It was the same one Emily and Michael had looked through after the funeral. The first few pages held pictures from when the kids were very young. Michael sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. Emily holding a tiny stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere for nearly 2 years. Then there were pictures of family vacations, camping trips, birthday parties, school events. Every photo seemed to capture a moment when the 4 of us were together. But as the pages continued, the photos slowly changed. More pictures of the kids alone. Graduations. College dorm rooms. Friends I barely recognized. Eventually there were pictures taken in places I had never even visited. Cities far away. Apartments I had only seen during short visits. The album told a story I hadn't fully noticed before. At the beginning, our lives were completely connected. Later, they slowly began to branch outward. Like the limbs of the maple tree outside my window. Growing in different directions. That night I closed the album and sat quietly in the living room for a while. Not sad exactly. Just thoughtful. A few days later, Emily called. Her voice sounded slightly tired. Hi, Dad. Hi, sweetheart. How are you doing? I'm good. She told me about a long week at work. Something about a deadline that had kept her at the office late several nights in a row. I listened the way I always had. Occasionally asking small questions. Eventually she laughed softly. You're still good at that. At what? Listening. I smiled. Well, that was always part of the job. There was a short silence on the line. Then she said something I hadn't expected. Do you ever feel strange now that the house is so quiet? The question surprised me. A little, I admitted. Me too, she said. I waited for her to explain. When I visit now, she continued, it feels different from when we were kids. Not bad, just different. I know what you mean. Another quiet pause. Then she said something else. You used to do so much for us. What do you mean? All those little things. Fixing stuff. Helping with homework. Driving us everywhere. I chuckled softly. That's what parents do. I know. I just never realized how much you were doing at the time. Her words lingered with me long after we ended the call. Because she was right. When you're raising children, you rarely think about how much of your life revolves around them. Helping them becomes normal. Solving problems becomes routine. You wake up each day knowing someone will need something from you. And then one day, they don't. Not because they don't care. Not because they've forgotten you. But because they've learned to stand on their own. That night, sitting alone in the quiet house, I began to understand something that had been slowly forming in my mind for weeks. Maybe the feeling I had in the kitchen that afternoon wasn't really about my children not needing me anymore. Maybe it was about something else entirely. Maybe it was about learning how to exist in a new kind of relationship with them. One where I wasn't the center of every problem that needed solving. One where my role had quietly shifted without me fully noticing. And perhaps the hardest part of that shift wasn't loneliness. It was learning that love between a parent and child doesn't disappear when they stop needing your help. It simply changes shape. For a long time after that conversation with Emily, I kept thinking about the word she used. Different. It wasn't a sad word. It wasn't an angry one either. Just honest. Different. That's what life had become. Different from the years when the house echoed with footsteps running down the hallway. Different from the evenings when dinner conversations stretched long after the plates were empty. Different from the weekends when the garage was full of half-finished projects, and children asking questions faster than I could answer them. But different doesn't always mean worse. Sometimes it simply means the story has moved into another chapter. Still, it took me a while to truly accept that. One afternoon in early autumn, I decided to drive out to the lake where we used to spend time when the kids were young. It wasn't far, about 20 minutes from the house, but I hadn't visited in years. Back then we used to go almost every Sunday during the summer. Michael liked to skip rocks across the water while Emily searched the shoreline for shells and smooth stones. My wife always packed a small cooler with sandwiches and lemonade. The four of us would sit on the wooden dock watching the sun move slowly across the sky. Those days had felt ordinary at the time. Now they felt almost sacred. When I arrived at the lake, the parking lot was nearly empty. A cool breeze moved across the water, carrying the faint smell of fallen leaves. Autumn had started to color the trees surrounding the shoreline. I walked down to the same dock where we used to sit. The wood creaked slightly under my feet, just like it had years ago. For a while I simply stood there looking out at the water. Memory has a strange way of layering the past over the present. For a moment I could almost see Michael sitting at the edge of the dock again, carefully selecting the flattest stones he could find. "Dad, watch this one," he would say. Then the rock would bounce once, twice, sometimes 3 or 4 times before sinking beneath the surface. Emily usually sat beside my wife reading a book. Every now and then she looked up and asked questions about the birds flying overhead. Back then it felt like those moments would last forever. But of course they didn't. Nothing does. After a while I sat down on the edge of the dock and picked up a small stone. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the smooth surface worn down by years of water and time. Then I tossed it gently across the lake. It skipped twice before disappearing beneath the ripples. I smiled to myself. Not bad. As I stood up to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The sound surprised me. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. "Michael," I answered. "Hey, Dad." "Hi, Michael. Where are you?" "At the lake. The old one we used to visit?" "That's the one." He laughed softly. "That place feels like another lifetime." In some ways it was. There was a short pause. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "I was actually calling to ask if you wanted to come visit next weekend." "Visit you?" "Yeah. I thought maybe we could spend a day working on the car. It's been making a strange noise again." I chuckled. Some things never change. True. Then he added, "But that's not the only reason." "What do you mean?" "Well, I was thinking maybe we could grab dinner afterward. There's a place near my house that reminds me of the diner we used to go to when I was a kid. For a moment I didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to go. Just because something about the invitation felt different from the calls I had grown used to. He wasn't just asking for help. He was asking to spend time together. "I'd like that," I said finally. "Good." We talked for another few minutes before hanging up. As I walked back toward the car, I noticed something about the way I felt. The quiet no longer seemed as heavy as it had before. Because the truth was something I had slowly begun to understand over the past few months. My children hadn't stopped needing me. Not really. They had simply stopped needing me in the same ways they once did. When they were young, they needed me to fix things, to answer questions, to guide them through problems they didn't yet understand. But now they needed something else. Sometimes they needed someone who remembered the beginning of their story. Someone who could sit across the table and laugh about a crooked birdhouse roof from 20 years ago. Someone who knew who they were before the rest of the world started shaping them. And maybe, in a quieter way, they still needed a place that felt like home. Later that evening, when I returned to the house, I made myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. The maple tree outside the window swayed gently in the wind. For the first time in a long while, the silence in the house didn't feel like something missing. It felt like space. Space for memories. Space for reflection. Space for the kind of conversations that only happen when people have grown enough to understand each other in new ways. Being a parent changes over time. At first it means being everything your children depend on. Later it means stepping back while they build lives of their own. And eventually, if you're lucky, it means something quieter but just as meaningful. It means becoming someone they choose to come back to. Not because they need you to solve their problems, but because somewhere deep inside, they still know you were part of the foundation that helped them become who they are. And sometimes, that's more than enough.